Hello, and welcome to today's webinar by O3 Solutions, Best-in-Class Approach to Project Execution Software, how O3 is leading the industry. Presented by Nick Maloof, Product Education Lead here at O3. So let's introduce Nick. He is our lead product education, and he has over 5 years of software industry experience. He assists with our client training and content creation. He's our #1 support lead here at O3, and he can answer pretty much any question you have about AWP software. So before we dive in, let's do a quick safety moment. As most of us are entering the warm months and summertime, these are just a few tips to keep in mind when you're outside, such as lawn equipment, insects, heat, and everything in between. So always keep in mind if you are using equipment to wear safety goggles, sturdy shoes, the proper clothing. Something people may not think of is to always protect your hearing when you're using loud equipment. Make sure everything is working right. Follow the instructions and the warning labels, especially when using anything that involves chemicals. And then keep in mind the sun, so wear the proper clothing, hat, always wear sunscreen, and sunglasses to prevent sun damage. And then just keep in mind how hot it is outside. You always need to drink probably more water than you think. And the source there, you can click to learn more. But with that, just stay safe as we are outside and keep in mind all those hazards. So today's agenda, we're here to learn how O3 drives your implementation and sets you up for long-term success. First, we're going to cover what is a software implementation, who is O3, how O3 handles an implementation, including workshops, sprint zero, configurations, training, support, and then we'll jump into self-sufficiency, and then key takeaways, and at the end, we'll have time for a question and answer. So with that, keep in mind, you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar panel throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to all of them at the very end. And you can always contact us, email us info@o3.solutions. And as a quick other reminder, you will receive a copy of today's recording along with the presentation slides to download. So here's a quick info on who O3 is. We're a modern web-based platform that leverages advanced work packaging and agile best practices to disrupt the status quo for companies in industrial construction who want to improve productivity, safety, quality, and predictability. Now I'm going to hand it over to Nick Maloof. Thank you for joining us today, Nick, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Tori. So if you've ever been to one of my previous webinars, you will know that I always like to start off with a quick level set. This time, we're going to talk about what a software implementation is. And a software implementation is the process of adopting and integrating a new software application into your organization's tool set. As you'll learn, there are going to be multiple stages to a software implementation. They'll start off with planning and development, and they conclude once the application is in production or actually being used by your team. Now, who is involved in a software implementation? Of course, there's the vendor. You'll hear me refer to them as the implementation team as well over the course of today's webinar. They're selling the product and they're going to be helping you set it up. Then you have the sponsor. They're the one that found the vendor and they're going to be the key driver to your team using this application. They will work with the vendor to ensure a successful implementation. Of course, it's going to take more than just the efforts of the vendor and the sponsor. Both will need the support of key stakeholders, senior level personnel that oversee the team's business operations. Using AWP software as an example, think of AWP champions, construction managers, work-based planning coordinators, and work-based planners. And last but not least, there are the end users. These are the individuals that will actually be using the software on the day-to-day basis. So what does a software implementation look like? While each implementation might vary based on your team's industry and the software needs, most include these 5 steps. The first step being requirements gathering. In general, your aim is to address these 3 questions. First, why the change? The implementation team needs to understand why you are abandoning your old solution in favor of a new one. The sponsor and key stakeholders need to understand why the new solution is an improvement over the previous one, so they can clearly communicate its benefits to the end users. Your end users need to know why they're shifting from one tool to another and how it's going to make their job easier. Next, does the data align? When transferring data from one system to another, there might be some inconsistencies. These need to be made known upfront so your implementation team can account for them when they are making configurations. And lastly, are there any edge cases? In the context of a software implementation, an edge case is typically a unique requirement your team has for the software. Again, your implementation team is going to want to know about this upfront so they can account for it when they are setting the software up for you. Next, we move on to planning. And the whole point of planning is to outline what needs to be done. Your implementation team needs to understand what needs to be configured and what deadlines they're working against. You also need to work with the vendor to identify key stakeholders involved in the implementation process, as well as the end users that will be using the software at the end. You need the right people in the room to ensure everyone's feedback is being accounted for once the final product is set up. Of course, you'll want to be aware of any risks that could undermine the implementation as well. Are there any potential detractors? And if so, what would make them averse to using this new solution? Does your team have a hard time adopting new technology? Making these risks known in the beginning allows your implementation team to be proactive in addressing them instead of being reactive partway through the implementation. And then before configurations can begin, you need to make sure your implementation team has all the data they need. Not having the necessary data can stall the vendor from getting everything set up and push your implementation over schedule. They also need to understand where it's coming from. This provides context as to how the data looks in its current state and how it needs to be set up in the new system. On top of that, they need to know who owns it. This gives the implementation team a point of contact in the event that they need any clarifications. And then there's the mode of data transfer. Is it going to be a manual upload? If so, how often does this need to take place? Or is it going to be an automated integration? Integrations can really help to streamline your team's workflow, but they do require a bit of upfront planning and work. So again, the implementation team is going to want to be aware of these early on. Once the vendor has the data they need, they can go ahead and start configuring the software. Configurations might be made and reviewed incrementally or all at once, depending on the complexity of the software. Regardless, you need to keep in mind if the adjustments made so far support your team's processes. You don't want to find out post-implementation that the configurations are a hindrance to your teammates when you made this change to make their lives easier. And when the configurations are done, the implementation team will confirm the software is ready for production. Does everything meet the specifications you and your stakeholders made? Is the data accurate and in the correct format? Ultimately, it's going to be you and your team that are going to be that final approval before they go live on the software. Once everything is production ready, it's time to start rolling it out to your team. The whole point of training is to ensure your team understands both how the software works and how they're going to be utilizing it. Without the proper training, long-term adoption is impossible. And then there's your mode of training. Your implementation team will offer live training, self-paced training, or maybe some combination. And your live training could be either in person, on site, or it could be done remotely. At some point, training will no longer be the vendor's responsibility, and it's going to be your team's responsibility instead. When that time comes, you need to ensure there's a proper handover so that your team is capable of onboarding future users and training them on how to use the software. So now that we've discussed what a software implementation looks like in general, let's discuss what you might expect from an O3 implementation. O3's implementations are simple and they include 5 different steps, though they do tend to overlap in sequence. The first is going to be our virtual workshops. This is going to be the very first activity in your implementation after the kickoff call. It will include O3's implementation team, and then it's also going to include key stakeholders from your end. These workshops take place virtually over the course of 5 1.5-hour sessions. Typically, this takes place over 1 to 2 weeks. So what do we seek to accomplish with these workshops? First, we want to understand your work packaging process, and this is going to include your current workflows. as well as the obstacles that your team currently has affecting them. You chose O3 to be better than your previous solution, and understanding how your current setup is and the troubles you face is going to help us to deliver on that. We also want to know what stakeholders are going to be involved. As I mentioned before, we need all the right people in the room so everyone's feedback is accounted for when your implementation is done. And O3 offers insights into data in real time. The implementation team will learn about what KPIs are currently being tracked on the project and how O3 can support these KPIs, but also help expand your reporting and improve your visibility. And then there's the data. We want to understand a few different things here. The first being what data you want tracked in O3, where it is coming from, so if it's going to be migrated from any external systems, and who owns that data. Again, this is something we want to have clearly defined before configurations begin. This presents a huge roadblock if it's not handled early in the implementation. Finally, we want to make sure you understand O3's implementation process. From beginning to end, we will let you know what to expect. Once the workshop is done, it is time for what we like to call Sprint Zero. Before that though, O3 takes an agile approach to its implementations. We start by adding all your implementation tasks to a backlog. These represent all the work that needs to take place over the course of your setup. We like to work in 2-week increments. This means we decide on what we want to accomplish over the next 2 weeks and we stick to it. This ensures that our implementation team has clear goals in mind and we won't deviate from them because of unplanned work being pulled in. And then once those 2 weeks are done, it's back to the backlog. We see what remains, and then we will continue to repeat the process until your implementation has concluded. So with that being said, we kick off this sprint process with Sprint Zero. Think of it as a level set on what needs to be accomplished. We review your backlog in its entirety, so all the work that needs to be done, and make sure everyone understands what the scope of work is. We also take an early look at who is going to own what. We want to establish that accountability quickly so that there's no confusion on who is involved and what they're doing. In conjunction to our sprint process, we like to take a stage gate approach. We define high-level objectives that act as milestones for your implementation. And once each of those high-level objectives or milestones are completed, your implementation is done. And then once we have kicked off your sprint process, it is time for configurations to begin. Your configurations will not take place all at once. We work with you to prioritize which features need to be implemented first, and then ultimately when these features need to be implemented by. Before configurations, we offer you and your stakeholders a demonstration. This lets you know what features are available for use, ask questions on how they can be set up, and inform you on which ones you ultimately want to implement on your end. Based on your feedback, we configure these features to support your team's processes. And once that's done, we make sure the right people review our work before we move on to the next set of tasks. And once configurations are done, it's time to roll it out to the team. So before we can start, or before your team can start using it officially, they need to learn how to use it. O3 takes a combined approach to training. We start off by enrolling your team in our self-paced training series, which typically covers the basics of O3, work packaging, and constraint management. When that's done, we move into live training. These training sessions are more targeted, so they'll build upon what you learned in the self-paced training. Your team will learn how to manage work packages, both graphically and non-graphically, and how to manage their constraints. Then we ensure your team is ready to own the training process once you're live. We do this through a series of certifications that prove your team's competency in O3 and their ability to carry out these responsibilities. The goal of our implementation is ultimately to make you self-sufficient, to minimize how much you need to rely on us. But that being said, we are always here to help, even when your implementation is done. We continue to touch base with you shortly after your implementation is concluded to make sure that self-sufficiency is sustained. We accomplish this with routine meetings and health checks where we'll look at adoption metrics to ensure that software usage remains strong. If there are any obstacles that your team faces, we work with you to make sure they are cleared. And all the while, we also like to keep an open line of communication so that you can explore new avenues in O3 should you be interested. After all, our development team does a great job at constantly improving our product. We have bi-weekly software releases, meaning there are tons of improvements and additions being made all the time. And with that, let's talk about risk. Every project is subject to it, and software implementations are no exception. The first one we'll talk about is conflicting interests. Old habits die hard, and not everyone is willing to part with their old processes and tool sets. Make sure you have the right people in the room so that everyone's feedback is accounted for, especially the end users, because ultimately they're going to be the ones using it most frequently. And we've alluded to this many times. Oh, my apologies. We've alluded this many times. Not having your data ready can stall an implementation, causing it to go over schedule. You don't want to find out mid-implementation that there's missing data that you have to chase down. Obstacles and setbacks are inevitable on any project. Removing these impediments is difficult, and especially without that accountability and a lack of frequent communication. And training is often considered an afterthought when talking about software implementations, but if your team doesn't understand how to use the software effectively, it really doesn't matter how much work you've put in up to this point. All of your efforts are going to be wasted. So that being said, how do we mitigate these risks? And first, you want to understand that need for change. Cast a wide net when gathering this feedback on your current tool sets. Make sure you're aware of the current problems and that your new solution will address them. Another way you're going to really understand this need for change is by, really getting feedback from your team and securing team buy-in. Spend time highlighting the benefits of this new solution and how it is an improvement over the old one. Show how it's going to make their lives easier and improve your team's workflow. Your team members will be assisting the implementation team while getting the software up and running. Make sure they're aware of their role and whether they're providing data, acting as a point of contact, assisting with onboarding, etc. I know I sound like a broken record with this, but having your data in hand and ready to turn over before configurations begin. In my experience, this has been one of the biggest holdups for implementations. Not having that necessary data limits what your implementation team can do. And lastly, do not underestimate the importance of training. Like I said, you cannot expect your implementation to be successful if you don't put serious thought towards training and adoption. So before we conclude today's webinar, I want to go ahead and leave you with some key points that we've discussed. The first one being making sure you have the right people in the room. You want everyone's voice to be heard and accounted for when the implementation is done. This is essential to securing team buy-in. Not having your team buy into the product can lead to adoption issues down the line. And when your implementation team has the necessary data early on, it ensures they won't be held up when configuring the software. If the data is constantly changing, define who will provide the new data and when it needs to be uploaded into the new system. And never, ever, ever underestimate the importance of training. It doesn't matter how much work you've put in up until this point if your team is not going to use it effectively. When you prioritize training, adoption is guaranteed to improve. And implementations don't have to be complicated. Our client success team will show you the ropes and guide you along the way. By the end of your implementation, we make sure you're self-sufficient and capable of managing things on your own. And lastly, we are always here to help. Even when your implementation is done, our client success team will meet with you at set intervals to ensure software usage is healthy and that there are no roadblocks standing in the way of your team. Of course, you'll also continue to have access to O3's support article library, which has over 200 articles in it and is constantly being updated, as well as our support team. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tori to close out today's webinar.
All right, thank you, Nick, for that great presentation. So to follow up, you can reach out and learn more from O3. We've got tons of free material on our website that you can download, including case studies. You can go look at our past webinars. We've got tons of videos that help explain more about our solution suite and AWP in general. And then you can always connect with us on social media and sign up for our newsletter so that you always are up to date on the latest content and events that we are hosting. So with that, let's jump into some questions. So Nick, the first one I've got here is, what is the typical time it takes for an implementation to be done start to finish?
That is a good question. So ultimately, this depends on both the complexity of the implementation and how prepared your team is to get it up and running. So we can see implementations, or our smaller implementations can be done as quickly as 1 to 2 weeks, while our larger ones tend to be a few months. But that being said, if your team, really has a proactive attitude towards it, has the data ready when it's needed, we can easily see that number go down.
All right, and then here's one that says, how does O3 gather ideas from clients to improve the software?
So there's a couple different ways. So you're going to have, a channel of communication with your dedicated project manager over the course of the implementation, where we will field feedback there and submit it to our product team. And then even after your implementation is done, we're constantly fielding feature requests from our users as well via our support app.
Okay, and then do you do any on-site implementations, or is it all remote?
So our implementations are done virtually. This allows us to spend more time, getting the software up and running, being in meetings with you, and less time for us having to worry about the logistics of travel. That being said, we do make occasional on-site visits, but these are typically after the implementation is done and at the request of the client.
Great. And then, is Agile project management the same as AWP?
That's a very good question. There are definitely parallels, but I wouldn't say they're the exact same. So, both methodologies center around, compiling all of your work into a backlog, prioritizing it, and then pulling from that backlog and kind of taking bites out of it in 2 to 4 week increments. So, but I definitely wouldn't say that they are the exact same.
Okay, and then who is usually involved from the client / key stakeholders for the implementation?
So in terms of an O3 software implementation, we typically see a couple executive level personnel. One of them might be the sponsor for O3. And then, really we start to see more senior level personnel. So think of your construction managers. We'll also see some work-based planning coordinators and work-based planners. So those tend to be the first people that get involved in the implementation. But later on, once things are set up and established fairly well, we also start to involve parts of your field crew to make sure that the current setup works for everybody.
All right, well that looks like about all the time we have for today. But again, thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you still have questions or you'd like more information, you can always email us or search our website. We will happily respond to you as soon as possible. And look for our next webinar. It'll be towards the end of June. We'll post that on our website as well as social media. So just stay tuned for that. And thank you all again for joining us today. And thank you, Nick, for this great info.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you all.
All right, we'll see y'all next time.